Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 2 of the Digital Side Podcast. I'm your host, Cliff Madrew, Vice President of Pre-Sales Solution Architecture at Iron Mountain, and I'm joined by my co-host, James Dowd, our Chief Solution Architect. James?
Hey everyone, how's it going? You might have noticed that we are not in the office in Boston this week. We are actually broadcasting from our respective homes. This is a confession. Cliff and I are now in a long distance relationship, so we Skype a lot and we talk on the camera. So you're now seeing a little bit behind the scenes. This is how we interact. So it's good to see you again, Cliff. Good to speak to you, sir.
Yes. And welcome, everybody. Okay, well, today's topic, we want to cover a pretty large topic today, but it's an interesting one, and I believe a lot of people will get a lot of value out of it. Today, we want to talk about transformation from both the perspective of IT transformation and digital transformation. And I was engaged in a conversation a couple of weeks ago at a CIO event with a particular CIO. And it was interesting because he was talking me through some of his, what he was calling digital transformation efforts. And what I found interesting about it is everything that he was describing to me was really just IT transformation. And I think there's a lot of, cloudiness, if you will, because, pun intended, right? The cloud is involved in a lot of transformation efforts. But, and both James and I are dads, so we're allowed to make dad jokes on this podcast. But, there's a lot of, there's a lot that goes into both IT transformation and digital transformation, but there's a very clear differentiation between the two. And even at Iron Mountain, we think about how we can best serve our customers. And so I want to talk through from our customers' lens and the conversations that I've had, what I've learned around IT transformation. And, in this particular case, the gentleman was describing conversion of machines from physical to virtual, changing database applications and changing how they're provisioning storage and leveraging the cloud. And those things really are transformation projects in IT, and they're not necessarily the driving force behind what one would deem digital transformation. And I'll let James get into some examples and some things that he's experienced in conversation. But before I do, I just want to talk about the definitions of both of those things. From an IT transformation perspective, this is really an assessment and overhaul of an organization's information technology systems, at least as described and prescribed by Google. But what I mean by that, really, it's changing out components of IT and how it's delivered, as a support function of something bigger, typically, right? And again, that's within your information technology system. So it may be, going from having a physical server to a virtual machine that's hosted in Amazon, right? Leveraging on-premise storage or leveraging S3 compatible storage or block storage within a cloud. And, those things, although critical to digital transformation, they don't necessarily drive digital transformation. Digital transformation, and I'm going to read a little excerpt from an article that I think was on CIO magazine. Digital transformation marks a radical rethinking of how an organization uses technology, people, and processes to fundamentally change business performance. And that's really where the difference lies, right? Digital transformation is about how you impact the business. And that's really important because business transformation is a totally different state of mind than IT transformation. It changes how you approach challenges and how you deal with specific challenges within an organization. And we, collectively, whether that is humanity or Iron Mountain as a business or, you as an individual, really need to start thinking through that lens because it supports how businesses improve their customer experience, how they meet regulations, how they meet business objectives, improve revenue, get more efficiencies and lower costs. All of those things play into a digital transformation effort. And it's really all about that business or line of business within an organization. And again, thinking about a problem or a challenge, or, in the case of myself and my team, how we architect a solution, it really matters how that impacts the business, and it really changes how you look at a problem. So I'll pause there and hand it over to James to talk through that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so I think that's the major differentiator, right? When you're talking about digital transformation versus IT transformation. So I spent a good amount of my career, 15, 16 years, working for internal IT organizations as an engineer. And when we would think about something that was transformative, I think you said it, but just to echo the sentiment, you're talking about something that's very specific around a very specific and defined IT process, right? I'm going to change the way I store something. I'm going to change what database I use. More recently, I'm going to go from an on-premise solution to something in the cloud. Those are very discrete things. They influence a very specific process that's defined, and you're simply swapping in and out components, right? The challenge with IT, and I noticed it when I was working in IT, and really I really noticed it when I transitioned into consulting into business. IT sometimes gets fixated on the idea of technology for technology, where you're simply swapping one for one because you want to commoditize what you have to lower cost, right? Where you're simply saying, all right, this cost me X in effort and money and investment. If I go to an alternative, it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be Y. That's the change I want to make, right? But that change is motivated simply by the technology change. When you look at digital transformation more holistically from a business perspective, the differentiator is that anything that's going to be done around a quote unquote digital transformation is going to be driven by data, and it's often driven by the data that an organization already has but isn't able to access and use effectively. So where technology comes into that is enabling the access to that data and then the ability to use it in a meaningful way. So a digital transformation is usually about taking something that the company knows but can't access, accessing the data, and then finding new insights, opportunities, and revenue streams for the business. And that's a real departure from doing IT just for the sake of doing IT. So when I went into consulting, working almost 10 years ago now, but since I went into a different kind of thing other than engineering, the guy who was mentoring me said that you want to move as close to the money as possible, right? So what he meant by that is you want to get as close to the stream of income. That's where you really start contributing to the business. A business transformation is often a profit center, or it's a direct way to prevent a loss, like from compliance or fines or something like that. There's real money tied to it. IT often is very abstracted from that. It's, hey, I have a budget, I need to implement, I want to go from Oracle to SQL, or I want to go from SAP to Oracle ERP, right? Something like that. It's very abstracted from the business goals a lot of the time. In my opinion, that's the differentiator between an IT transformation, straight IT transformation, and a digital transformation.
Yeah.
And I think when you brought up that CIO, it kind of illustrates that point. Those guys often think in terms of what's good for IT. Really, where your bang for the buck is thinking about what's good for the business.
Yeah, and I would say I think I mean that was one of many conversations that day, and many other leaders, right, were really thinking through that lens, right, around the business, and that's something you look at our CIO, you look at many CIOs that are out there. I think there's really been a shift and a transformation in their mindset, right, and I think that's why it's important because if you went back 10 5 10 15 years ago, it probably would have been very different, right? I think it can't be understated the importance of IT within the organization because they help drive the transformation of the environment that supports some digital transformation effort, right? And they become a key part of that. Right?
So I would say the technology, simply didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, and you're right. One of the things that drives it is, and it sounds like a given now, but what drives it is surplus compute, network, and storage. So when IT infrastructure modernized, especially when it moved to things like virtualization, which really opened up a whole new, playing field of IT, you no longer were building machines that just had enough capacity to do this thing, right? You were building machines that had tremendous amounts of processors and memory and storage, and that surplus allowed you to look at doing other things with your data. So I think it's almost inherently that IT is involved in the transformation, but the question becomes what drives the transformation, not how it's implemented necessarily, but philosophically what's driving the transformation. Is it acquiring a revenue stream? Is it acquiring insights about your customer? Or is it simply making infrastructure changes for the sake of making infrastructure changes? And in my mind, that's the real difference.
Right. Yeah, and we've done a lot at Iron Mountain on both sides of that equation. But I can tell you, with a shift in our strategy, where we're really trying to focus is on, the side of digital around what is driving the business, right? And what type of value-added services can we enable, for customers, right, as a partner, to help them through that transformation. And there are IT components to that. But when you get into some of the services that we've offered in the past and really where we're looking to go in the future, right, that's a big area of focus for us. It's really about helping that digital effort and bringing together a portfolio of solutions that can better enable customers to get that value that you just described, right? Whether that's extracting data, whether that's changing a process, right? Because in our world where we really help customers that are moving from a physical world, paper-based world or backup tape-based world to a digital world where we can improve their process by doing a digital workflow in place of something that was manual and physical-based before. That process improvement can be part of a bigger transformation strategy because, like you said before, now you're enabling access to data that either didn't exist digitally before, right?
Or wasn't accessible, right?
Or wasn't accessible before. And now you can take that data and leverage it to do new things that drive new business, right? That drive a better process, that drive greater efficiencies in the business. So again, I think it's a phrase that's thrown around, but I think it was worth just digging in. And from here, I think if we can just maybe talk through some examples
Sure.
of things that we've observed and even I know we're going to bring up some customer examples of customers that we've worked with that truly have gone through a digital transformation effort. I want to describe that and talk a little bit about our part of that effort, and then I think it will allow us to reflect on where we're going as a business and where we've been.
So I think what you're going to see in that, right? And one of the examples that jumps to mind is kind of a funny one because it just happened. Digital transformation is happening everywhere, right? So the market is essentially an oligarchy now. It's a stable market. There's a couple of players that commoditize everything they can commoditize. So driving data and insights into data and how to engage with customers and things like that is now the future, right? And it's happening everywhere. So kind of amusingly this afternoon, and I don't know how happy my son will be with me telling this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So my son is 13. He's in middle school. And I got an email today from the school that says he was late twice, and that if he's late again, he's going to get detention. Right. So that reminded me, and I talked to Cliff a little bit about it, but I'll share the story again. When I was in high school, I came up with the brilliant idea of never, ever, ever handing in a piece of paper that had my mother or father's signature on it. Right. So if you were going to be late or you were going to be absent, you had to bring a note. Right. That was before they digitized everything. So I just signed the note. They had nothing to compare it to. My mother's signature, I had been signing it from the get-go, and that's how I never got detention. I missed as much school as I wanted. It's funny because you mentioned being a father. It's a very much a do as I say, not do as I do situation, because I would be appalled if my children did it. But I felt like I was getting one over. And I always was pretty good with that. And you were able to get away with it. And even to the point where like the report card would come home and I would just take it out of the mail and rip it up, right? So nobody would see it. There were no ways of tracking that. There was no effective way of informing people. Now, the data always existed, right? The school always tracked that data. They just had no way of using it. But now all that stuff goes away, right? Because now it's a computer, right, that's sending an email, because that's at the beginning of the year. They ask you, what's your email? My wife and I both put it in. And there's also a website that says, your son has missed X number of days. He's missed these many assignments. Not to say that he's a bad kid. He's actually a pretty good student. But just for the sake of this illustration, you really can't get away with anything. And it seems like a really mundane example, but that's a real tangible example of digital transformation. They're taking data that they already had, that even 5 or 10 years ago they couldn't effectively use. They're mining that data for insights about their user community, which in this case happens to be parents and students. And they've taken a digital process and they've said, all right, these are the criteria that you're meeting, and now we'll automatically notify, keep them in the loop. They're delivering, if you look at it from a business perspective, they're delivering much better customer service, and they've eliminated a tremendous number of flaws in the process, the ability to manipulate the system by simply digitizing and using the data in a different way.
Right.
Now, that being said, right, and what I said to you before is it's almost tragic because, that kind of American tradition of blowing off school and having those experiences, and we talked about it being like Ferris Bueller, something I think in the soul of the student dies by doing this, but certainly the process is much improved.
I think there would be a difference of opinions on the subject. I would say that, from a personal perspective, right, our traditions may have not been the same, but that's fine.
Well, you know what? Look how I turned out. So you got that.
And here we are.
Here we are.
Oh, Lord.
The digital side podcast. That's what happened. Just get the whole
No, but I mean, and actually, you brought up earlier a good example of kind of another market that is being disrupted. So we talked on the last podcast. We talked a little bit about Uber and kind of how everyone is well aware of how that's ride sharing and has disrupted the transportation market. But in this case, we were talking about the used car market. So I'm gonna just kick off with a quick little video, and then we'll talk through it. This is something a commercial that I saw recently, and James actually brought it up, and I thought it was just a great way to think about disruption and how transformation is again, driving disruption in a market. So I'm going to play this real quick. So this company is called Carvana, and James is going to talk you through a little bit of their history and the relevancy and how we came across this. But what you're seeing here is a car vending machine. So this is changing the way that you can buy a used car and gain access to ultimately, a much better selection of vehicles, right? And order of magnitude better selection of vehicles. And so for those that are watching the video, we just kind of played through that commercial for their car vending machine. But James, I'll let you kind of just talk through, the experience and what you've observed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I got into it as a consumer, right? So my wife's car is getting toward the end of its payments. It's got a few miles on it. We're considering either, not having a few payments for a year if we could, that'd be great, or getting another car. And we recently, my daughter is in her last year of college, so we bought her a car because presumably she's going to work at some point. So we just went through the experience of going to a car dealer to buy a used car. And what I noticed in that experience is you have a very limited selection. By my house, let's just, for argument's sake, there's 5 car dealers that I would drive to that are reasonable to drive through, and each one of those has 20 cars, right? So we're talking about a pool of 100 cars, and maybe 5 or 6 of them meet my criteria, right? And that's a very traditional to buy a used car. You're either going to a classified ad, or you're going to the side of a road where there's a car on the side of the road, or you're going to a dealer. And I would even say that the idea of buying from a classified ad has gone away too, and that's a whole other digital transformation in and of itself. But right now you're limited to a car dealer or the side of the road effectively. So when we bought this car, I said, all right, maybe I want to get a new car, maybe I want to get my wife a car. So I started looking around, and what I discovered from using Carvana is that I can buy a 3-year-old car. I was actually looking at a 3-year-old Mercedes for less than it would cost for the Honda that I bought, right? Which sounds kind of crazy because they're not the same class of cars. But I was looking at a Mercedes with 9,000 miles on it that just came off a lease for like $23,000, $24,000. Very good deal. I was not able to duplicate that going to the car dealers. There was nothing comparable to that. Maybe one car, right? With Carvana, I went on there and I said, all right, I want a sunroof, right? And I want these models, and I want this much mileage, and I want this much price to pay. And it brought me back literally hundreds and hundreds of examples of this car from all over the country. It takes data that exists already, because we actually did a little research into this company. They were founded in 1977 as a company called Ugly Ducklings in Tempe, Arizona. And they were a rental car company, a little independent rental car company. And their business grew into going to auctions and buying cars and then selling them to a network of dealerships. They changed their name in, I believe, 2002 to a company called Drive Time, which I'd actually heard of previously. But they were a used car company. They would buy wholesale used cars from auctions and they would sell them to, let's say, 200 or 300 dealers across the United States. That was their business. They had a revenue at the time in 2012 of about $780,000.
Million.
I'm sorry, $1 million. So they were sub a billion, but they weren't a small company, right? So what they did is they came up with this Carvana idea in 2012, and they actually ended up spinning it off in 2014. They took the exact same process they were doing, right, where they were buying the auction cars and they were holding them. And instead of selling them to a network of dealerships, they went out and they said, all right, what do we know about the way people buy cars, right? What are the obstacles to that? What are the advantages to that? What are the limitations of it, right? So the limitation is as a very small selection locally, right? There's really no way to compare price or features locally. And then the limitation being is that most people want to drive a car before they buy it. And that's a big one if you're going to buy something on the internet. It's like buying shoes, right? Most people like to try shoes on before they buy a shoe. Cars, the same thing, but just a lot more expensive, right? So what they did is they actually started, making hundreds of thousands of cars available to people from their website, and they give you 7 days to test drive it. So that overcame that limitation. Plus, it gave you this tremendous amount of choices, and they could be price competitive, and they can also set the price because there's no way to negotiate. And you don't have that. It's probably an overhead. There's probably a bump to buy from them, but it's so much more convenient and so much more selection that you feel like you're getting a deal.
Yeah. I mean, and time will tell on, I mean, that company in particular, but the point is, think about A, the technology involved, right?
Sure.
B, that transformation effort, totally reliant on an IT transformation project, right?
Absolutely.
I can't imagine that rental car facility, right, is anything comparable to, how this company evolved over time.
That's the digital transformation. So you're absolutely right. And that's why it ties to revenue, because they went from being spun off in 2012. They were publicly traded at the end of 2015. In 2016, their revenue was, sub a billion. It was about 800 and change million. This year's revenue, mid year, is already tracking to be $2 billion.
Right.
So it's transforming their business from a revenue perspective. They took what they already knew how to do. They used improved IT processes. They got insight from the data they had, and they made a giant new revenue stream, doubled their revenue.
Right.
And, they're even to the point, and for a startup, it's a big deal. They are probably going to be profitable this year, in 2 years. Their operating costs are coming down. Their revenue is going up. Seemingly it's a successful company that really is based on a tiny little rental car company that was founded 40 years ago in Tempe, Arizona. And now it's a $2 billion business nationwide.
Man, it's like it's like a company, like a mushroom farm growing into a multi-billion-dollar information management company.
Hey, that's nobody gets that joke but us.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, everyone who's from Iron Mountain will get that joke, but go on Wikipedia, look up Iron Mountain and look at our history. Yeah, no, we've had quite an evolution as an organization, and we continue to do it. So it's pretty amazing. So I want to bring it back to, I mean, that's a great example, and some people I'm sure can relate. I'm sure they've seen the commercials out there, but I think it's always great to have something that we've had personal experience in. And, we helped a customer pretty recently. This is a public utility provider for electricity. And, they were going through a pretty decent digital transformation effort. And what I like about this story is that we were really involved in part of the IT transformation that was tied to that overall effort. And I think this will help delineate between, IT transformation and digital transformation and how different organizations can play a part, because we really were helping them transform a component of their IT environment. We weren't necessarily helping them on these, the services that were enabling this digital transformation. And so I think it's a great example. Before we kick off and, before I have you start with the conversation for that particular customer, I think it's important to know that, IT transformation is almost always a part of a digital transformation project, right? In many cases, not every case, but nearly every case, right? There's going to be some IT system that is going to, be along for the ride, so to speak. But
I
it,
think you'd be hard pressed to find an example where it's not. I mean, the digital part of the digital transformation is IT. I
yeah.
mean, that's a lot of it.
Well, I think what'll end up happening though is you'll have, it's like you said earlier, IT, starts to become a commodity, right? In many cases, it is a commodity today. And as most organizations standardize on that commodity, and listen, it'll continue to evolve, right? You'll still have these projects. I don't think they may not be to the same degree that they are now or they have been when virtualization came out, right? But at some point, you're going to have a pretty solid platform that is managed, it's in a cloud, wherever it might be, and then you're going to focus a lot of time and energy around your digital needs, right? Your information management type needs, right? Your needs around accessing data, around providing a better service to customers, right? Process improvement, right? Meeting some regulatory needs like we talked about before. The things that really we categorize under digital transformation, I think you'll see a lot of the focus because you'll have that solid core foundation, and then what you build on that, right? You can build more than one thing in potentially, and those are the examples that maybe won't be so much pulling along a major leap in the IT transformation, right? But anyway, I just think it's important to note that. But let's talk a little bit about this particular customer and what they were doing and kind of where we played and where we didn't play.
Sure. So I actually did the design on this one. So this is a major public utility, and the nature of the project, Cliff's point is we only got on the tail end of it. We actually helped them with their compliance portion of it, where the data was then archived because they're public, so they got audited. So we had to archive the data for them. But the gist of the project was that they are replacing the traditional electric meters that are on houses and apartments and commercial buildings with electronic meters, smart meters. So what those would essentially do is instead of somebody coming out to your house or your business and reading the meter, right? And the guy comes on with a pad or a tablet and actually notes this would be reporting your power usage in real time. So why is that important from a transformation standpoint? Well, there's a few reasons from my perspective. First of all, if you're like me, you probably have a balanced budget for your electric, right? That's how we pay for it. So every year they tell us you're going to pay X amount every month because that's predicted off of my last year's power consumption. And what sometimes happens, more often than I like, but sometimes happens in October or November, they come to me and they go, all right, you use 25-30% more power than we anticipated, and you owe us X amount of money, right? So that's a hassle for me, and it's a hassle for the company because they have to collect, they have to send people out to do it, they have to estimate, and they have to figure out, what's my energy usage for next year based on these estimates. Right off the bat, these smart meters eliminate that because they're giving real-time data. You no longer have to send anybody out, so you can potentially save that cost. And you also have the ability to actually have the billing be in real time, so you don't have to sit there and true up the bill at the end of the year, which improves your accounts receivable process. But what it also does, and I think this is the more fundamental transformation, is it allows the electric company to predict their usage in a more reasonable way so they don't have things like brownouts in the summer. So you're not in a situation where we predicted, we needed X amount of energy, but we really needed Y, and now we're not serving the customers. Or more to their bottom line, it's not July, and I'm 50 or 60% over my energy consumption that I projected, and I have to buy oil emergency, or I have to buy power from another grid on an emergency, which exponentially increases my cost. The transformative part of this is it becomes a heck of a lot more efficient, right? It becomes a heck of a lot cheaper. And it also allows them to look at the data that they have in a meaningful way to control their costs, but also to be more green. And
Yeah.
that's a very popular thing now, right?
Well, it's
They can
popular,
make
and
better
I mean, it
decisions, right?
direct impact on the business, right? There's
Sure.
so much goodness about this story, only because it's it's a transformation project that legitimately, is a digital transformation effort. It
Right.
uses Internet of Things devices, right? So now you
Yeah.
have these smart meters, right, that are connected devices,
And
highly
replacing devices that are 25, 30 years old that are completely analog. So
right,
it's actually digital, right?
right. It is actually, a digital conversion project, but again, it kind of it's a good, it's a really good example of an Internet of Things deployment it's creating a heck of a lot more data, right? But they're immediately leveraging that data and seeing return on. I'm sure this was a massive investment, right? And this is where you can clearly see the line between what it means to have digital transformation. Now I'm going to talk, now let's talk about our piece of, our piece of this, right? Because what we really serve for this particular customer was more along the data protection and the storage side, right? And it was around an IT transformation effort because they wanted to leverage the cloud for this particular part of the service. We weren't necessarily in this case helping on the broader transformation effort. We were focused really on part of the IT transformation that was pulled along with this, correct?
Yeah, that's my involvement was primarily around storage and compliance.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay. So, just talk a little bit about what that was. So in our case, we're offering a cloud storage service, right, for their long-term retention data to meet compliance needs, right?
Yeah, so this was taking the data that they were using from the new smart meters that was being generated by the smart meters, and they were storing it. So there's actually two parts to that. So yes, the primary driver was compliance, right? They needed this data kept for X number of years, but it was also formatted in a way that it could be accessed. So one of the things that, although we didn't do it for this particular customer, we were more storage based, but stuff that we do for other customers and stuff that was being done here, by another product, but it's still being done, was taking that data and then mining it for business insights, right? So the important part ultimately of any of these transformations is that you need the data in a usable format. You need to be able to say, it's not, I hate to say it, but it's not bound on a tape. It's not on a piece of paper. It's not, in some really proprietary format. It's in something that's usable and accessible because, once the data is in that format, and that's really what this project accomplished, in addition to compliance, you'll discover ways to use the data, right? So an old boss once said to me that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? It's sort of the same concept. Once you have this data, you almost become acclimated to mining it, to figuring out different ways to use it. Putting the data in a usable format is a big part of the digital transformation. It was for this particular client, and it is in general, because you can graft on tons of services around that. You can graft on hundreds of things, AI, ML, tons of things,
Right.
once the data is usable.
Exactly. And I think that's, again, that's a great way to pivot into how, we think about our customers and how we think about the evolution of our service portfolio, right? This is a great example where, we solved a problem for our customer, right? We met the requirement around long-term data retention. We met the security requirements that they had, right? They had very specific needs and we were able to meet them. But where we go with many other customers, right, and where we continue to evolve our portfolio, you look at our platform called Insight, right, which is our analytics capability. That's a great example of, this is the type of a data set where we can help customers extract value. We have endless numbers of examples of customers who have changed from a physical to a digital workflow, right? And we've helped them through that process. Again, once you create that kind of, that repository of digital information, and once you once you have the appropriate tools, you can truly help a customer through through a real digital transformation project. And that's where our focus is, and that doesn't start or end with analytics.
No, I mean, analytics is important, but it's once you have the data, you can do a lot of cool stuff. I would even say that analytics is kind of programmed into a lot of the stuff. It's kind of the core of it, but the options that you have there are endless. I mean, once the data's there, you could do classification where you could do an AI program or a machine learning program that can go into your data and discover different groupings and different relationships between it. You can do compliance and governance in ways that you're really not able to do now, especially around things like the requirements of the European Union. Once you have the data, you can sanitize the data.
Yeah.
Sounds like something that it might not be sexy, but it's compliant, and it'll cost you money if you don't do it.
Yeah, and it's complex, right? So if you
It's very complex. Yeah.
and this is where I've seen we really shine, and just it's a massive challenge for the market because some of it's that physical data, like we talked about, creating, this digital
Absolutely.
repository. Some of it is existing digital information that is, that needs to be brought together, right, with this data, right? And how do you, even doing the classification of that data before it even hits the repository, and understanding what exists in some of your other cloud environments or your on-premise environment, all of that effort around knowing the information, migrating that information if required, or analyzing it in place, just and then and then leveraging some of the metadata and some of the data that you've extracted for for further classification, right, to meet a regulatory requirement, right, to meet a business need, whatever it might be. That's that's where we have just amassed so much experience from a industry vertical perspective, right? Because it varies dramatically between industries, right? In meeting some of those compliance needs in particular, and that's where I think we add a lot of value. So when I talk about value-added services in our portfolio, that's where you'll see a lot of our focus in the future, I believe.
I mean, our product set can do everything from taking paper records and scanning them into a system that allows them to be searchable, which is important. It makes it as easy to interact with as a PDF or a Word document, stuff that's been sitting in a box. It does that. It goes all the way to predictive analysis, where it's making recommendations about how I can improve my process and my business.
Right.
The other thing that people take for granted, once this data is here, we actually have an engine that takes compliance requirements based on region and vertical and a whole bunch of other things, and lays it on top of your data to tell you, what are your retention requirements? Are you out of band? Well, that can be done automatically once the data is there.
Right.
The real power of it ends up being that at the end of the day, every piece of information that you've gathered about your business, your customer, your market, historically, for however long you've been keeping those records, becomes accessible and usable. And that's the game changer. The tools you put on top of it facilitate that. But the idea that every piece of knowledge that you've acquired and however long you've been operating now becomes usable, and now becomes something that you can use to drive decision points to improve your business.
Right.
That's a very powerful thing, and it's really unique because it's hitting now. It wasn't available 10 years ago. The data was there, but you couldn't do anything with it.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we're talking kind of, as we have a conversation about this, this is some of the cutting edge of our portfolio, right? We've built
Yeah,
these repositories. We've built this policy center, right, which give you some of the capabilities that you were talking about. Only now is that being integrated, into some of these content management systems, and integrated into some of these analytics platforms, so that you can leverage all of that data. And it is game changing, as you put it. And I think that's a perfect way for us to end today, because that is
yep,
transformation, right? Transformation is about those game changing things, whether it's disrupting a market like we talked about earlier, whether it's disrupting a process, whether it's evolving how you're interacting and doing business with your customers. It's the world is evolving with this digital transformation that we talk about. Hopefully we've defined that a little bit better for people. Hopefully people understand how IT plays a part in that transformation. And hopefully everyone understands how critical this truly is, because this is a whole new world that we're evolving in. So with that, I
definitely.
appreciate
Maybe,
everybody's time, and hopefully you
yeah.
found this valuable.
Um, it was good talking to everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the podcast. We will be back, hopefully quicker than last time. Now that we have our little rig set up in the offices, and it's good talking to you all. Cliff, it was good talking to you, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yep, take care.